Welcome you all to the session 6 video of Cost and Management Accounting 3rd semester BCom. In the previous session, session 5, we had discussed about cost unit and cost center. So in this session, we'll have a discussion of classification of cost. We know that a mere knowledge of total cost cannot satisfy the needs of the management. For proper plan control as well as to take proper decisions, the cost has to be classified. So we are going to study as to how we are classifying the cost. First, we need to understand the meaning of classification. Classifying means grouping the items based on some common features. The process of grouping the cost according to some common characteristics is known as the classification of cost. It is the process of allocating each item and placing like items together according to their common features. Now, let us see how we can classify the cost. We can classify the cost on the basis of the nature or elements. We can classify on the basis of the traceability or identifiability. We can classify based on the functions. We can classify the cost based on the variability or the behavior of the cost. We can classify cost based on the controllability as well as based on normality. In this session, we will see the first three aspects, that is based on nature, based on traceability as well as based on function. So the first classification of cost based on nature or elements. Now, we can classify the cost as the material cost, labor and expenses. Now, with an example, I will start. Take an example of a furniture manufacturing. Now, we have to incur cost on the materials, that is the timber which is used for the furniture, the wood. We have to pay salary to the carpenter or the workers. We also have to incur some expenses other than material and labor. For example, it may be the design of the furniture to be manufactured, it may be the rent or power charges. So there are three categories. They are the material cost, the labor cost and the expenses. So what are material cost? These are the cost of materials which are used for production. It involves the cost of materials as well as all other expenses incurred in acquiring the materials, that is the carriage which is being paid, the duties, insurance, etc. Now, the next comes labor. Labor is the payment made to the employees. That is, it's the cost of wages, bonus and allowances which are paid to the employees. And then we have expenses. So, any expense other than material cost and labor cost which are incurred in the manufacture of a product are called as expenses. So, for example, the cost which is incurred on a special design of the product, the rent paid, the power charges, the water charges being paid, the insurance being paid, all these comes under the expenses. So, based on the elements or nature, cost can be classified into three types. They are the materials, labor and expenses. Now, let us see the second type of classification, that is the classification of cost on the basis of identifiability or traceability. Now, what is this? It is based on how we can allocate a cost to the cost center. So, here we can classify the cost into two types. They are direct cost and indirect cost. So, what are these direct costs? We'll see. Direct costs are those costs which can be directly identified with the product. Now, I'll give you an example, the same example of the furniture. Now, we use timber for manufacturing a furniture. The timber or the wood which you are using, we can directly allocate the cost of the timber to each item of furniture. We can identify the cost of material used in each furniture. At the same time, we may also use some other materials like nails, gums, etc. during the process of manufacturing. In this case, we cannot exactly identify how much quantity of gum is used for each product. So such costs are indirect costs. So what are direct costs? Direct costs are those which can be directly identified with the product and which can be allocated to the cost center. For example, the timber which is used in the furniture or the cloth which is used in the garments. We call it them as the direct cost. So indirect costs are those costs which cannot be directly identified and allocated to the cost center. The cotton waste, the lubricants and other materials which are of small value. Now I gave an example of nails. Nails are of small value, so they are considered as a part of indirect cost. The cost can be classified into direct cost and indirect cost based on the identifiability or traceability. So we have classified it into direct cost and indirect cost. So direct cost, we have direct materials. It can be classified into direct labor, direct expenses. The indirect cost also, there are indirect materials, indirect labor and indirect expenses. Now, what are these direct material costs? These are the cost of materials which can be directly allocated to the product. So it is not only the cost of material, as I have already told you, these are the costs which are incurred to material as well as the cost incurred in acquiring the materials. The example of timber which is used in a furniture, the direct labor cost. These are the cost of wages of workers who are directly engaged in the production. So they are known as direct labor cost. So in a furniture factory, for example, the wages paid to the carpenter is direct wages. Then we have direct expenses. These are the expenses other than direct material and direct labor, which can be directly identified or linked to the cost center. We also call it as chargeable expenses. Now, for example, the cost which is incurred on a special design or a pattern or a software which is used for production of a product, we call it as direct expenses. Now, coming to indirect cost, we have indirect materials. These are the cost of materials which cannot be directly allocated to cost center. So these are the cost of material which are small in value and which cannot be identified with the product. Now, for example, in a garments factory, the cloth which is used for manufacture is direct cost. At the same time, we use the thread which is used for stitching is of small value and we cannot directly identify as to how much of it is used for each dress, isn't it? So it is indirect material cost. We have indirect labor. Indirect labor is the cost of wages paid to employees who are not directly engaged in production. For example, the wages of the storekeeper is not directly involved in production, but wages are to be paid for the work which he has carried out, or the salary which is paid to the administrative staff and all those things comes under indirect labor. Indirect expenses. Expenses other than material and labor which cannot be directly identified with the cost center. For example, the rent charges or the insurance or power charges, water charges, all these come under indirect expenses. So we have two categories, direct cost and indirect cost. Under direct cost, direct materials, direct labor and direct expenses. Under indirect cost, indirect material, indirect labor and indirect expenses. Now, let us come to the third type of classification, that is classification of cost on the basis of the functions. So we classify it into production cost, administrative cost, selling cost and distribution cost. I also classify it as research and development cost, also another category. Now, what are these production costs? Production cost or factory cost we call it as, or works overheads we call it as. These are all the indirect expenses which are incurred on the operations, the production process in the business organization. So these are the indirect material, indirect wages in the factory, factory expenses like rent, rate, insurance, repair, depreciation, and all indirect expenses incurred in the factory for the purpose of production. We call it as production cost. It's also known as the factory overheads or works overheads or manufacturing cost. Now we have administrative overheads or administrative cost. or office expenses we call. This is all type of expenses which are incurred in the direction, control and administration of an undertaking. That is the office expenses like office rent, taxes paid, insurance paid, lighting, staff salary, printing and stationery, postage, telephone, the director's salary, manager's salary, legal expenses incurred. So all these expenses which are incurred for the administrative aspects of the business organization. You have the next one, the selling overheads or selling costs, all the expenses which are incurred in securing as well as retaining the customers for the products. So creating and maintaining the demand for the product, that is the salary paid to sales personnel, the commission paid for them, the discount distributor, the advertisement, publicity, sales promotion, the gift samples, all these come under selling cost or selling overheads. The next one is the distribution overheads or distribution cost. It consists of all expenditure incurred from the time the product is completed until it reached the final destination. Now, for example, the rent, warehouse staff salary, insurance for the material products, expenses on delivery van, expenses on packing and loading, carriage outwards, and all are such expenses which are incurred in distributing our products to the final customers. So on the basis of functions, we can classify the cost into production cost, which is also known as factory overheads or works overheads, administrative cost, which is also known as administrative overheads or office overheads, selling cost or selling overheads, and distribution cost or distribution overheads. So these are the different types of classification of cost. Thank you.